What is good? Deepak Chona, SportsMed Analytics, bringing you another round of NFL injury updates. Thank you very much for joining. Now let's get it popping. Now we start with the biggest name in fantasy, and that is none other than Christian McCaffrey. So he's returned to practice. The timeline here suggests that everything they've been telling us this offseason is true, meaning that his calf strain is probably relatively minor. The data favors him playing week 1 at about 100%, but the concern with these calf strains, and especially for a running back who's really on his toes pushing off for agility, is that there is a non-zero re-injury risk, and that is somewhere around 15% for the first 8 weeks of the season. Overall, though, I think for those who are drafting still, taking Christian McCaffrey at the 101, totally reasonable move, and I would plug and play him week 1 without hesitation. Then we have Jahmyr Gibbs. So the data here projects that he's probably playing week 1 at about 90% efficiency. The key, however, is that running backs, when they first come off of hamstrings, do tend to see a little bit lighter workload that first week back. A little bit extra value for David Montgomery in DFS. The reason for that lighter workload probably has to do with re-injury risk. Hamstring strains, especially for running backs, do tend to recur. And Jahmyr Gibbs has actually had this happen in his past. So you combine those two factors, and Jahmyr Gibbs is looking at a 20% re-injury rate over the first half of the season. Then we have Puka Nacua. So more optimism here. Sean McVay's comments this offseason have suggested that this was an injury to his bursa over the knee, which is like a protective sac. It's not structurally dangerous to play through, but it can be annoying, sometimes painful, and it can swell up when aggravated. So with that being said, we wouldn't expect any production dip for week 1 or significant real in-season risk of Puka missing time as this season progresses. The other aspect of this is that Sean McVay is rated on Coach Speak Index as having a 90% accuracy rate for his injury comments and discussions. And therefore, it just further strengthens our confidence in Puka Nacua going into this season. Then we have Jaylen Waddle. Now, the interesting thing about Jaylen Waddle, they've been a little bit vague with the reports. Everything so far has suggested that this is a mild injury, and he came out with a sleeve on his calf. So even though they never formally reported it to us, we do suspect that this was a mild calf strain that he was playing through. Now, Jaylen Waddle, if you look at his last season, he was very frequently on the injury report, often missed practice even, but he usually played through. And as a result, he probably played at less than 100%. So you probably saw stats that aren't reflective of a full performance of Jaylen Waddle. Now, he's likely 100% going into week 1. Again, with these calf strains, and especially for a wide receiver, there's about a 15% re-injury rate those first 8 weeks back. But with that being said, we wouldn't necessarily drop Waddle's ranking, and we definitely would not bench him if you have him. Then we have Jaylen Warren. So the data here favors him playing off of his hamstring, similar to Jahmyr Gibbs, at about a 90% efficiency per touch. The key, though, again, running backs tend to see fewer touches that first game back. So you may look for a little bit of a boost to Najee Harris. And Jaylen Warren and Najee Harris both are kind of neck and neck to begin with. So again, a little bit less touches for Jaylen Warren probably means a little more for Najee. A 15% re-injury risk those first 8 weeks is the key with Jaylen Warren. Then we have a pretty promising report on Christian Watson. So he was dealing with hamstring and recurring hamstring injuries over the last year and really more than that. Now, he has reportedly not missed a single offseason practice. And that suggests that what he worked on this offseason, meaning that hamstring strength asymmetry, has really taken effect and done a good job. And the data here really does suggest that that should occur. So going into this offseason, when they sort of diagnosed the problem for Christian Watson, they said he had a 20% strength difference side to side. And that's a lot. Now, when we test athletes for return to sports, we find that a 10% difference is really the key threshold at which their re-injury rate lowers a lot. And so with Christian Watson, He's now at reportedly about an 8% difference. So that's extremely promising. Data suggests that it should lower his injury risk going into this coming season. So we have rising optimism for his ability to stay healthy. Then Roman Wilson of the Steelers. So he was coming off of what looked from the pictures and video that like a high ankle. It certainly has behaved like a high ankle in the sense that they've rested him pretty significantly. And even now he's only practicing in limited capacity. The data does slightly favor him playing week 1 at about 55% chance. That will either increase or decrease based on subsequent practice reports this week. Now, if he's active, we would expect a dip in his targets and efficiency. So each of those takes about a 15% dip, leaving him somewhere in the 65 to 70% total production range for his baseline capacity. The other key is that you often see an elevated injury risk. And with these high ankles, especially with young players, wouldn't be totally surprising for the Steelers to work him back in slowly, just as a result of managing that re-injury risk. Next up is Jonathon Brooks. Now, this is my personal favorite player to stash on the IR and then use him when he comes back. Now, the data favors returning week 5. There is typically a 4-game ramp up, and we definitely saw this with Breece Hall off of his ACL last year. The initial timeline, meaning if Jonathon Brooks comes back at week 5, our data favors him being at 85% explosiveness and 85% meaning per touch efficiency in production. Now, that ramps up by the midpoint of the season to hitting his 90% point. And if you look at the timeline for his touches, that also projects to ramp up around the same timeline, meaning that week 9 onwards, he's likely to have an unrestricted workload. He's a high draft pick, good athlete, strong running back. We're not totally sure about the offense, but there's some reason for optimism there. And with that, Jonathon Brooks expects to have unrestricted workload, good efficiency on a per touch basis. So we like the way his back half of the season is shaping up. And then we have Josh Downs of the Colts dealing with a high ankle. We got some vaguely positive comments from Coach Shane Steichen, and that does suggest that he's progressing well. However, the data still does slightly favor him sitting week 1, and that's at about a 60% clip. Now, the more likely return here, week 1 certainly possible, but more likely would be returning week 2 or week 3. The other aspect of the Downs injury that's important is very much like Roman Wilson that we just talked about, these young receivers coming off of high ankles. The key is them being able to cut and turn and make those routes as crisp as possible coming off of these rotational injuries. So as a result of all that, you think that they would play it on the slower side. Again, with Josh Downs, we're looking for his return to performance more like week 3, week 4, but returning to the field most likely week 2. Next up is Christian Kirk. So he's got a mild calf, and that timeline, he was only out for a couple of weeks from practice, and that timeline really does confirm that this was in fact a mild severity. He's had a soft tissue history in the past. He's plays a position that is a little bit prone to soft tissue injuries, meaning wide receiver. And he's not up there in age, but he's not young either. He's about 28 years old. Now, the re-injury rate, when you factor all of that in, is about 20% his first 8 weeks back. So Christian Kirk probably playing week 1, probably pretty solid when he's out there, but there is some risk associated. Next up, we have MarShawn Lloyd. So he practiced for 2 days in a row off of his hamstring. Keep in mind, this was a re-aggravated hamstring. So they're resting him on Tuesday, and I think their hope is that he ends up sustainably back here. It really strongly suggests that they are not going to push him all the way into the game. I think the data does favor him playing week 1 by a little bit. The key, though, is going to be that Wednesday practice report, and we'll see if that holds up. If he practices in limited capacity, then we would anticipate that most likely MarShawn Lloyd suits up. But either way, we're likely seeing a limited workload here, so I would be avoiding MarShawn Lloyd in most formats. Next is Curtis Samuel. So he's had a turf toe injury he's been dealing with for a few weeks. he's practiced it in a limited fashion, and that is kind of promising in the sense that it means he's trending towards playing. But coming off of the turf toe for a wide receiver, you have to imagine it's really involved in the way you push off and explode in and out of your cuts. So wide receivers typically see a performance hit, usually about 20% in their initial return. Next up, we have a pair of comeback player of the year candidates. First up, Kyler Murray, and this is a big time sleeper opportunity. A huge target for me in pretty much all draft formats. Now, he's plus 2,000 on DraftKings Sportsbook for comeback player of the year. In my opinion, pretty solid dark horse candidate there. And the reason for that, aside from the fact that they've upgraded the offense, adding Marvin Harrison, adding Trey Benson as well, you look at Kyler Murray's year 2 post ACL, and the data on this does project a return to his pre-injury rushing explosiveness. Now, that holds true for running backs and for quarterbacks. And if you look at Kyler Murray and some of the comments that he made towards the end of last year and this offseason, they're pretty convincing that he didn't fully trust that knee as he tried to make his cuts. And for that reason, I would say Kyler Murray, if he's back and trusting the cuts that he can make, I think you're looking at a pretty high rushing ceiling here. And then another high rushing ceiling, Anthony Richardson of the Colts. So he's plus 700 for comeback player of the year. The data here is in his favor in the sense that it does suggest a return to his pre-injury throwing strength and accuracy. Now, to be determined really if his pre-injury throwing strength and accuracy is good enough to really excel in the NFL to the level that you would need to win comeback player of the year. The other part of this, though, is that the question very reasonably, is Anthony Richardson injury prone? He played basically 4 games last year and had 2 injuries. And the key, though, is that Anthony Richardson, if he has learned to slide, that lowers his injury rate drastically. So we find that rushing quarterbacks are not necessarily at a higher injury rate than pocket quarterbacks. The key, though, is how they approach hits. So in the data, the ones who lower their shoulder, they face injury rates similar to those of running backs, meaning they miss about 2 games per year on average. And the ones who slide or run out of bounds or in other ways avoid hits, they tend to have a much lower injury rate, actually even lower than pocket-based quarterbacks, probably because they're elusive and they can run around, escape pressure, and escape hits as well. So with Anthony Richardson, there's a lot to be learned about his playing style, how it's changed, and how that affects him going forward, and also his play quality. Frankly, is it good enough to be in the NFL and at a high level? Now, for me, at plus 700, I think there's just plenty of other value for this particular bet, but it's not an unreasonable bet to take. Then we have another quarterback, Trevor Lawrence. So the reason we're talking about him, he's not injured right now. We look at his 2023 with a giant grain of salt. And the reason for that, if you look at his injuries, week 6, knee contusion. Week 13, pretty significant high ankle. Week 15, concussion. Week 16, AC joint sprain of his shoulder. All of those are very real injuries. And if you look at them, everything other than the concussion would be expected to have hurt his performance. So Trevor Lawrence, we think that you can't really look at his 2023 as highly reflective of who he is as a quarterback now. So looking a lot more promising. He's fallen down draft boards pretty significantly, but looking a lot more promising as we go into this season. Next up, we have Romeo Doubs of the Packers. So they're playing on Friday night. He's got a hand contusion, but reportedly still practicing and still catching in practice. So because he's still catching, despite this hand contusion, we are suspecting this is probably a low severity injury and that he's likely playing week 1. Next up, a couple of defensive players. First, Christian Barmore of the Patriots. So we got a lot of questions about this one. He's got blood clots was the diagnosis. It's a potentially very dangerous diagnosis that can kill even a perfectly healthy person if it's not treated promptly and somewhat aggressively. There's a lot of variability here, but you may remember Chris Bosh a few years back in the NBA, who basically missed multiple seasons. His career was entirely changed by the diagnosis of blood clots. And that's because sometimes you got to go on blood thinners, and that is very dangerous for a football player to play through. Now, we would lean towards an extended period away from football. Obviously, bigger issues to sort of be settled here medically, but hopefully Christian Barmore is okay. Hopefully he will be back, but we'd be so surprised if it is this season. Then we have the Dolphins' Bradley Chubb. So he's a pass rusher. He's post ACL, happened relatively late in the year. And all of these factors together expect a major dip in his year one post ACL. Now, with that being said, data does favor him returning probably in November as the most likely. And early November is really what our algorithm predicts here. But there's a lot of variability, especially for defensive players, because they're not just having to deal with planned cuts and changes of direction, but they're constantly having to react. And as a result, these injuries, ACLs, high ankles, do tend to affect them a little bit more than the offensive side. And that's all we got for today. Thank you again for joining. If you got questions for us, drop them in the comments section or hit us up on Twitter and IG. Until next time, see you then.